Good morning. I have to say I'm very glad to be here. I know my predecessors, René Lévesque in the 70s, did a lot of conferences in the Western Canada. Jacques Parizeau was here in 1991. And I always thought, before I start the conference, I really genuinely thought that the conversation we read often in the media and in the political space of Quebec and Alberta debating their own choices, whether that choice is right or wrong and whether they would have done the same choice, is just the wrong framework. I always thought that if you take a step back and you think about democracy and respect of our respective parliaments, there's a lot to be said and there's a lot of space for collaboration. So it's in that mentality that I come here this morning. Leaders of the Parti Québécois who have done that. I've done a few conferences in England, Scotland, France, and Belgium, basically to explain why we're doing this again, why it's still there, that idea of Quebec's independence, and to answer questions. I love universities for that. So I really thank the School of Public Policy of the University of Calgary for hosting me. I want to just a quick word on Charlie Kirk. I want to say that what we're doing this morning is very important, whether you agree with me or not. So I just want to, because as you know, being an independentist is not always easy in the sense that criticism can get quite intense. There's been threats in my case, threats for many people who take part of in the public debate. And I just want to say that what we're doing this morning, no matter whether or not you agree with me, is very important for democracy. So I thought I had to say this. And this conference is about democracy. I mean, you want the answer to what does Quebec want? Self-determination through democracy. It's plain and simple, so there's no substitute for it. It was true for patriots in Quebec in 1837-38, saying, we cannot be in a colonial regime where our voice doesn't count, where we're not in a genuine democracy. That idea has been there forever, and it's still the same idea. So the fundamental idea behind the resurgence of Quebec's independence is that we don't think that it's viable to have a parliament that is not ours, in which we have around 20% of the seats. We don't think it's viable in terms of getting the right policies for our specific context. What is this specific context? We're 2% of francophones in North America. It comes with a different culture, you might say. It comes with different choices, whether they're good or they're bad. That's not the point. And we have a parliament called the National Assembly making choices that are contradicted by that parliament or that regime so often that it is still a problem of democracy. You probably know Jane Jacobs, so American author living in Toronto who wrote a book, The Question of Quebec Separatism. Everything is in there. If you're interested in understanding those dynamics, she foresaw everything. Mainly that if you have a government unit that is so big with different realities, different regions, and that that unit will have to decide between competing or incompatible interests, well, it's not ideal at all. She thought that if Montreal is to stay with some economic relevance, and if Quebec is to stay with some future for the French language, she thought that Quebec needed to be a country, because otherwise this 20% in the House of Commons wouldn't do it, wouldn't allow sustainability. And that's the second argument, to the fundamental argument to Quebec's independence. So the first one is that feeling that voting Bloc Québécois, that represents many of the aspirations of Quebecers, will never lead to a Canadian government. It's just pure democracy and self-determination. And the question becomes relevant in Alberta, because I don't know how you felt after 10 years of Justin Trudeau, but I had many criticisms. And it's a bit surprising that we're still in the same regime. So I think to a certain extent, you might have the same question. What do you do if you don't feel that your voice or your legitimate interests are not represented and there's no rotation of power? That's the case for Quebec all the time, because the Bloc Québécois will never be in power in Ottawa. Second argument that you probably know is linguistic and cultural sustainability. Honestly, I just don't think there's any future for the Francophone Quebec culture if we stay in Canada. And it's not a blame, it's just a reality. You cannot have policies that are carved in Ottawa not taking into account how fragile 2% in this small ecosystem of culture and language is. You cannot have the current system and still be speaking French and having a Quebec culture in 100 years from now, especially if you have immigration policies that are basically an ideological drift as far as I'm concerned. I'll get to that, but the shrinking of the French language in Quebec is a reality, it's documented, and it's directly linked to many federal policies that do not represent the will of the people on Quebec's territory. So that's a classic argument, but it's a more acute argument as of today because it's moving fast. With that comes the argument of political weight. So I said 20% of more or less of the seats or the parliament, but it comes with a weakening of Quebec in an ever-growing Canada in terms of population, in which case are we capable of following the pace with an integration in French? So far it's not the case. So we look at the situation, we cannot influence that parliament, and we cannot cope with those policies. And it's not as if it's an accident. I mean, the Century Initiative is not an accident. And it's not as if, like, I'm critical of Premier François Legault, but he said on several occasions, you need to listen to us in terms of adapting your policies to our reality. And public servants have said on several occasions to Justin Trudeau at the time, you're going to create the biggest housing crisis we've ever seen if you continue. And they continued willingly, intentionally. So it has to be said if you want to understand, and I see heads nodding, I mean, it's not only in Quebec. And it is undemocratic as far as I'm concerned because the democratic will is very clear. And it's set aside for ideological purposes. And one ideological difference between Quebec and the current Ottawa, and I'm not talking about Alberta, but it's a very important conversation about communitarism versus universalism. So in Quebec's mentality, and it's always been the case, everyone can become Quebecer. And they must become Quebecer if we have some chance of sustainability from a linguistic and cultural standpoint. But we never thought that Pierre Trudeau's idea of communities living aside one another, that clientelism based on ethnocultural identities, we never thought it's a viable model for social peace. Are we wrong? Are we right? I'm here to debate, but that's the case of what we think. That universality, identity based on being a citizen of a society, being equal because we all pay taxes, tax income to a government, and we're all bound by the same laws, that's a source of identity that creates social peace. But religious, ethnocultural, and community-based identity for us is unsustainable at many levels. One of which is social peace in terms of just Quebec has a reputation of being easygoing. You go to Montreal, it's safe, people are, in English you say joie de vivre. Yeah, there is that in Quebec, and we care about that. We think it's It has value. I might surprise you with the next argument, but I sincerely think, based on that document, the finance of an independent Quebec, signed by 6 different economists from 6 different universities, I really think it's a financial issue. So you might say, what's going on? We're sending you money and you're telling us that being part of that system is not beneficial to you. And I will have to answer yes, because the amount of waste and duplication in Ottawa is out of hand. The main problem in the analysis framework of what Ottawa does is that we always take for granted that what Ottawa does is useful, and that we would need to do the same if we would be independent. And I'm talking about Alberta, Quebec, or anyone. It's not true. It's just duplication. We're sending $90 billion every year to Ottawa. What do we get? Dysfunctional passports, an army, put it in, and what else? And if I become Premier of Quebec next year, I need to make healthcare, education, and social services work. And you might disagree on how generous the Quebec system is. Bottom line is, that is the democratic will of my people, and I intend to step up. But if I only have half of my tax income, the other half going to Ottawa for I don't know what, except for abuse of power and duplication, I have a serious problem in terms of governing. And that's what happened to François Legault, and that's what happened to Philippe Couillard, and that's what happened to everyone else before. It's very hard to be at a workable level of government if you only have more or less half of your revenues. And I don't think we're having value. I have a list of how many drifts and waste there's been in Ottawa. Maybe we take that list later on, but it is an issue for me. I talked about immigration and borders. I just want to say that Quebec has been very clear when Justin Trudeau opened Roxham and people were coming in without any planification nor criteria. Quebec has been very clear, what are you doing? We are not agreeing with that. And they just kept on. And again, borders will become an issue, whether we like it or not. And we can have a debate on how we have sustainable models, how we respect human rights while respecting that you do not invent overnight housing. You cannot create them overnight. But that's also an important factor. I would add a general factor of justice. And whether we agree or not, I just want to say that if you've been trying to get recognition internationally for centuries, recognition within Canada that you're a people, we got it in terms of you're a nation. But all this should lead to self-determination and democracy, direct democracy for Quebec's people. And it is a matter of justice because Francophones, as you know, were hanged, were deported, there's history behind this. It's just not something that we started talking about 10 years ago in Quebec. So for me, it is also a matter of justice for René Lévesque, for Jacques Parizeau, for people who lost the second referendum in all sorts of cheating. By the way, it's important, maybe we will be able to talk about it, but it is important for me to say that so you get the context in Quebec and the context of a country that cannot be reformed. So we've tried Meach, we've tried all sorts of accommodation. I know people are tired sometimes of how much accommodation there was, adjustments there were for Quebec. We can talk about that, but I think it's fair to say that that constitution and that regime is impossible to reform. And I think we could agree on that, which opens up a whole different conversation. What do we have in common and what can we work on together? Because one thing that worked well with the Legault's government, and we can have some parallel with Daniel Smith, is that the Legault government went with 21 fundamental demands to Ottawa, saying this is legitimate and we are such a strong government. We have 96 seats out of 125. We're so strong, you're going to listen to our demands and we're going to get some strong wins. That's what François Legault said on several occasions. Des gros gains, strong wins in Canada. Ended up with 0. So what's going to happen with Alberta, who has very legitimate demands, and it's not the same positions, it's not the same stance on what we should be doing on a subject or another, but it is self-determination and democracy. And in that sense, for me, it's very legitimate, whether Quebec would do the same or not. So we can open, I think, a conversation on the abuse of power there is from a constitution in 1867 on which we never voted, so Quebec was never consulted, but a constitution that never intended the federal government to grab as much money in our pocket to after intervene in all the powers of the provinces. I mean, what is it if it's not an abuse of power? Where is it written that you can just start deciding in the stead of a democratically elected parliament, using money, saying, if you're a university and you want federal money, which is your money, well, you'll have to follow the EDI criteria, the DEI criteria, you'll have to follow this, you'll have to do this. It's abusing the Constitution, as far as I'm concerned. So that's a fundamental point. And I have to say that arguing on how much money Quebec gets, we can debate on calculation. So you have Péréquation, but you also have direct investment and so on. It's irrelevant now, because if I'm premier next year, I agree that Quebec shouldn't have money from Alberta, and I respect your choices. I just want respect of our own choices. So it's obsolete. And all we have is an illegitimate government creating interference and trying to decide in our place and grabbing a lot of money for services I don't see. So, I mean, the size of the public service in Ottawa has almost doubled, and the quality of services have been really going the wrong way. And then you have Phoenix, Arrivcan, the sponsorship scandal, subsidies of Green Fund. I mean, why are we accepting that? I think it's worth to ask the question here in Alberta. And on the concept of abuse of power, it's not only the spending power that is abusive, it's also the way Ottawa has intervened in Quebec. So I just want to put in context maybe something that you haven't experienced yet. But the sponsorship scandal, cheating at the referendum, are things like arresting members of the PQ and independentists, poets in 1970, stealing the list of the members of the Parti Québécois. That's what the RCMP has done. Illegal spying on politicians. All leaders of the Parti Québécois have been spied on by Ottawa. So I assume right now that I'm being taped. All this is not normal. All this is not normal, and it is also abuse of power. When so I don't know how much time I've taken so far. We're done? You're good? So I'm just going to go, and we're going to cover the rest, but a few points that I would like to discuss. We could have a conversation space, a discussion and a thinking space directly between Quebec and Alberta, accepting that we might not have the same political orientations, but basically building a relationship based on respect. And respect is about respect of democracy and of our respective parliaments. And if we have that, we might find that there are several points where we can work together, and those where we don't agree, it's much better that we respect that we don't agree and we do our own thing than to have that federal government trying to impose things that will never be satisfying for everyone, because they are sometimes incompatible or conflicting interests. So someone will win, someone will not win. And you saw that with respect to the United States. You saw provinces negotiating directly because they know that the common position of Canada will be incompatible, irreconcilable, because it's not the same interest, it's not the same position. So there's some space, I think, and that's why I'm here. It doesn't matter what it creates, but there is a space for conversation about another framework, because I'm sure that we're, to a certain extent, bound to collaborate in the future, no matter how. But is the current framework working for you? Is it working for me? Could we imagine another framework that would be closer to what the word confederation actually means? I don't know. But I think it's important that we think about it, because I really believe that the current framework is not reformable, and it will create more abuse of power. It doesn't mean if you have an autonomist government right now, doesn't mean you won't win anything. The abuse of powers might stop a bit, you might gain something, but as soon as you'll have a government that is not autonomist, you'll see it will start again. It's the nature of power struggles, or the thirst for power, and I don't think that power in Ottawa is legitimate in terms of democracy, nor legitimate in terms of our constitution, which is a bit ironic. So that's the starting point for that conversation. I think it's exciting and necessary, so I'm very glad to be here this morning. Thank you.
I'm sure there are some people in the room who loved what you just said, and there are probably a few people who didn't love what you said.
That's the point. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here.
But I actually want to use that as an opportunity to say, and I think that the import of your visit here is, it needs to be stressed. I mean, Monsieur Plamondon is the leader of the Parti Québécois. I'm not sure indépendantiste, séparatiste, souverainiste.
Independentist is maybe the
it's never completely clear to me the difference between sovereignist and independentist and separatist.
It's never been.
But he is the leader of the Parti Québécois. And all of the polls in Quebec are suggesting it's maybe a year away, but you're sitting here with very likely the next premier of Quebec. That's a very interesting combination. And especially here in Alberta, given a lot of what's happening in the discourse, and yes, it's been a frustrating 10 years for sure for Alberta. So we're very, very fortunate to have you here. I also want to say that the University of Calgary, School of Public Policy, our job is not, we're not here to promote, we're not here to endorse. We are here very, very much, and this particularly in light of what happened yesterday in Utah. It is our job to provide the opportunity for views to be expressed, different views to be expressed, debate and discussion. And so I'm really, really proud to, have the School of Public Policy be able to host this, you and this discussion. Couple of we talked a little bit about what we would talk about. I was quite struck by your comment. When we get elected, if we get elected next year, Quebec doesn't want money from Alberta. That's very interesting comment, because it is a constant concern. You hear that here in Alberta often. How come we are giving so much money to Quebec through equalization, right? And you mentioned Péréquation, which is equalization. That's a very interesting comment, and I think it actually does set the stage for what you called a conversation space where maybe people in Quebec and maybe people in Alberta can have a conversation that goes beyond that kind of discussion. So when we talked about, we titled this Essential Allies, this session this morning, Essential Allies, with a question mark. I'm intrigued by your comment about conversation space, but are there other areas where you see like alliances, something more than just a place to engage together?
It is very fundamental point. So the truth is, I don't know to what level we'll find areas of collaboration. My hunch is that there are more than we think. And it all comes down to what you just said about Péréquation. So I think there was under Pierre Trudeau and the following years because of what they call the threat of separation of Quebec, and it's always vilified. It's always very scary. There was a will to create Canadian nation building, although the realities are so different from a region to another. And Péréquation,
which is equalization.
I'm sorry, I should...
That's okay.
Equalization is part of that Canadian system. And it's important that we say that receiving money is never a good thing from an economic growth standpoint. It's anti-entrepreneurial. It's been written everywhere in international development. Don't send money if you want to help a nation develop. It creates the exact opposite. Same thing for natural resources. That's another subject, but it's a bit of the same pattern. We need to be careful with money just coming out of the sky because it kills entrepreneurship. You have to remember also that when Alberta oil really spiked, it had an impact, a very clear impact on exports in Quebec. So having one monetary unit that reflects petroleum in Alberta has an impact on what we can do in Quebec. And we're told, yeah, you lost something there, but we're giving you money. And oftentimes, as far as I'm concerned, it comes with too much contempt. So I don't want that for Quebec's future. And I don't think it's healthy from an economic standpoint. And the thing is, we've calculated how does it look. It's been done 7 times. And if you take all the duplication and all the money spent on no services, on really ideological drifts in Ottawa, and you spend it on healthcare and education in Quebec, I think at the very end, even though we don't get equalization payments, we'll be better off. And it's more healthy in terms of taking initiative, in terms of building a future that is ours. It's way more healthy than this equalization system. So all the figures are here, and it's been verified by 6 economists.
I see a few people standing at the back. There are seats up here. We won't bite, I promise. Well, I can't promise for him, but I know I'm not going to bite, but I'm pretty sure he won't bite. So please, if feel free to move up. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet has said that you need a culture to be a country. And he, in quotes, I am not certain that oil and gas qualifies to define a culture. There's been lots of discussion about the separatist movement in Quebec has been based more on history, more on how the francophones were treated, how the disparity in opportunity between francophone and Anglo, more heart, more culture, as well as language. And I have heard some people say what Monsieur Blanchet said too. Well, we've many people in Alberta have felt really put upon by Ottawa, but from an economic perspective. We own our resources here. We should be able to. But I'm not sure there isn't also an emotional aspect of a different culture. But if there is, it's different. What are your thoughts?
Well, of course, if Yves-François Blanchet makes a statement, that's for him to give precisions. So I can only say what I see and what I think of that topic. Identity is very human. We cannot be individualistic to the point where we don't care about others. As I just mentioned, I don't think ethnocultural and religious identities are a good model for social peace. At least it's not the model I want for Quebec. But there will always be identity, and you cannot force identity, and you cannot deny people their identity. In which case, if Alberta, of course, democracy is a source of identity. So if you make a democratic choice altogether and it's not respected by Ottawa, it is a source of identity. But I think it goes further than that in the case of Alberta. So you have many sources of identity, and what I think would really be irrelevant in terms of what you feel is sufficient identity to build a project or do things that you feel ought to be done. So you don't dictate identity, it's there. and it can be the stampede, it can be a perspective on politics that are substantially and constantly different than other places. It can be some of your achievements that bring people together, and that level of identity is really your property. It's yours, and I think my opinion is irrelevant. And if it's there, it's there. It's you can't do anything about it. And in Quebec, it's been there for some reasons. It could be there for other reasons in Alberta, and it's just as worthy.
I think you know, and some people may know, although probably not many, I became very, very good friends with one of the ministers of Jacques Parizeau's cabinet. I remained a Federalist through all of those years, but it was a real opportunity for me to learn much more about where some of that sentiment came from. Parizeau was out here in 1991. I wasn't able to hear, but as I understand it, even then, he was saying to people out here, you in Alberta could learn an awful lot from what we're doing in Quebec. We're very similar. We have similar concerns. You know, we should engage more, I think, was the gist of what he was saying. And I don't know that anything really came of it, but people certainly still remember that. Do you think of yourself a little bit as Jacques Parizeau 2.0? And if you do, what would you do differently? Because in the end, obviously he was frustrated because in the end that referendum didn't go the direction he wanted it to go.
There's definitely something about Parizeau that I carry on. It's the coherence. So if I really think that there's no future for French and Quebec culture within the current framework, and if I really think that with half the income tax and the current parameters, the model of healthcare and education in Quebec is unsustainable, I need to be coherent and say that's what we ought to do, and that's what I will do, and it's up to the people in Quebec to respond. And that's what Parizeau really was about. He was just not shy of saying, I don't see any other options. He was correct if you see what happened in Quebec between 95 and today. It started with the sponsorship scandal, but it's also a lot of invasion of the federal in our own things. He was correct. It's a shame. I've said once that I'm really sad that we chose Pierre Trudeau over René Lévesque and that we chose Jean Chrétien over Jacques Parizeau. Because Lévesque and Parizeau were among our best in terms of honesty in politics and willingness to make Quebec grow. And I don't know what's the fate and the future for me and for Quebec. All I know is you need to say the truth and hope that truth will prevail. And there's a lot of lies. I don't know for your relationship with the federal, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a regime that lies a lot, and it's a regime that is immovable. We talked about the fact that it's quasi-immovable from a political standpoint, but it's also immovable through the judiciary power that are all aligned with the Liberal Party of Canada, in which case you need to be coherent, go as far as you can in terms of putting in question that regime, creating new alternatives, but you have no guarantee. One of my beliefs is that the fate or the destiny of Quebec is cumulative. So sometimes I'm asked in Quebec, oftentimes I'm asked, if Lévesque and Parizeau didn't succeed, why would you succeed? And my answer to that is, it's not about me, and I'm gaining everything that has been done since the Patriots. So it's cumulative, and the history of a nation, of a people, must make sense at some point. If the end of that story in Quebec is that we disappear from a linguistic and cultural standpoint, it doesn't make sense. So it's a larger question. It's almost philosophical. Life needs to have a purpose. It cannot be purposeless. It cannot be senseless. And in the case of Quebec's destiny, I have no guarantee, but I know that what I'm saying is most probably the truth given our recent and long history.
This wasn't one of the questions that we talked about, but I'm actually curious because Monsieur Legault is so far down in the polls, popularity very low. A lot of that is turning into support for the PQ, but not necessarily, it seems, from some of the polls into independence. You have a year between now and the next election. What are your thoughts about that?
I have no specific thoughts in the sense that if I just said that I'll give my best shot at telling the truth, I don't care. I don't control the results, and I accept the results because I accept democracy. And I've been told often in the past months, if you pull out your promise to hold a referendum in the first mandate, you're the premier. It's done. So just do it. And I won't do it. Because it's not true, because I don't really think that a premier in the current framework can make hospitals, schools, and social services work. I don't see any future for... If I think there's no future for the French and Quebec culture in that current framework, I have to say what I think. And people will decide. And so I would say I'm pretty detached from polls. I was at 9% and everybody said the PQ was dead on so many occasions. And when I decided not to give an oath to the King of England, people told me it's unconstitutional, illegal, and you'll lose your seat. So do it. I didn't do it. And I could have lost my seat, and I told my wife, what if I lose my seat? Are you okay with that? And she was just, you go. And that's it. So it does, I mean, it's an interesting topic. Democracy, colonization, truth. And it's not that I think that I have the supreme truth or the ultimate. I mean, democracy is about trying to find what's right by hearing everyone and debating. But I will not change what I think based on calculations in the polls. And people right now in Quebec, they have understood that because they've seen me for enough years. It will be 5 years for me in this fall as the leader of the Parti Québécois. Now they start to understand how I structure those decisions, and they're not surprised anymore.
Yeah. Thank you. Now to something a little more specific about what's happening with Alberta and potentially Quebec. Right now, the Prime Minister of Canada is about to announce more detail about the major projects effort. This is all part of the Building Canada C5. And I think everybody knows the headlines. They're on the current list. There is not a pipeline. But the reaction to that is I think people have to be aware, and we're very involved in this discussion here at the school. It must not be taken as an unwillingness of the Carney government to support pipeline or oil and gas projects. It is really, and they've been very clear so far in saying, we likely would support something like that, but we need the private sector to step up, right? So there needs to be an economic basis for it. I will, of course, then turn around and say, but the private sector is still feeling a little gun shy after the last 10 years. We still have an emissions cap. We still have some challenges. And so, we need to give the private sector more confidence that they can embark on major projects from an economic perspective. That's another conversation. There are political challenges as well, certainly with Northern Gateway and even then the Trans Mountain expansion. British Columbia, the government of British Columbia at the time, talk about constitution. We can have a conversation about Christy Clark imposing 5 conditions on building a pipeline across British Columbia that she constitutionally had no right to impose. She and I've had that conversation a few times, and it's quite interesting the rationale for that at the time. But there are an awful lot of people in Quebec who've been very vocal about being anti-pipeline. If there were an economic, so one part of the question is, what are your views about a government that is now actually talking about fast-tracking, getting big projects, clearly much more economically oriented than the one we've had in the last 10 years? But also, if there were an economic reason, that's a big if, but if there were economic reasons to have a pipeline going eastward, I think the original person to really promote that was Frank McKenna. I think it was maybe after he'd been Premier of New Brunswick. But the whole Energy East concept, right? The refineries in Sarnia and Montreal, the oil actually comes up from the United States to those refineries. But Montreal would, if it were to make sense to have oil from Alberta go to Montreal to be refined, would your government support that?
Okay, there are many things to be said.
There are a lot of few so things
about Mark Carney and national projects. I think the federal government is always trying to justify its existence by taking initiatives that really will lead to the kind of conflict of interests I was talking about earlier. So you need to arbitrate between interests that are incompatible, but at the same time you need to show that you are existing and you have a purpose and you're useful. So you create programs, you say, in all the fields of the provinces, you say, I'll do something, and you'll see federal campaigns now are just a festival of intrusion in provinces' competence. So from an economic standpoint, what I care about at the federal level is the level of debt. So no matter what project comes out of Mark Carney's national program, if he arrives with another 50, 60, 70 billion deficit once again, the rest is really irrelevant. What are they doing? Because it's our debt. You just need to make a small division calculation. What's the share of Alberta of that deficit once again? And we have no control over it. So if we talk economics, I'd rather have a conversation between Alberta and Quebec and have no deficit growing for no reason at the federal level. On the specific question of gas or oil pipelines going through Quebec, it's interesting because you said, you talked about somebody in Quebec having that, you talk about people's reaction to it. And that's the starting point. So put yourself in the shoes of someone in Quebec who's been told, yeah, there could be a pipeline going through your fields and rivers. And here's the data on how many times those pipelines have been leaking in North America in the past 30 years. Just look at the data and ask yourself, if you're that person in Quebec, how will you react to that? Of course, then the federal government will tell us it's economic growth. Make a calculation as to how many jobs will be created in Quebec assembling those tunnels. Maybe 20, 30, maybe 100 jobs, temporary jobs. So it's just a matter of seeing that on that topic, of course, a government of the Parti Québécois will always base its decision on democracy and social acceptability from the standpoint of those people. Truth is, I don't know on my desk, I've never seen a project of that nature. I've never read a paper on that. But I have to be honest, the first response of people in Quebec will be to look at how many times those things have done environmental damage by spilling or other incidents, and they'll look at economic growth through that project, and they'll see very few jobs, temporary jobs. And I think you can understand that standpoint as well as I can understand the standpoint of Alberta Oil wanting to grow and find ways to send that. So that's where it stands right now. But I have to say that having the federal trying to impose things will not make that conversation easier. So I'd rather be here and listen to what people have to say to me and be transparent about how people will react in Quebec and have at least a very transparent and direct, thus useful conversation about that and other topics than to have the federal trying to impose another thing that will create, well, some people more utilitaristic will say that could be useful for Quebec's independence project, but from a really public service point of view, the right way to go is to accept that Alberta has interest, we have interest, and if we talk directly, it's maybe less interference than having the federal government trying to find a justification for its existence through projects that maybe you were not consulted, and we were certainly not consulted.
You know, it's interesting because you focus there on environmental damage from leaking. Our experience in Alberta is that so much of the anti-fossil fuel, anti-oil and gas has not actually been so much from leaking. It was there a bit, certainly in Christy Clark's time, and there was real concern about a pipeline across certain sensitive areas, including the water, the ocean. That's another conversation to be had. But over the years, by far the shift became by far more a concern about global climate and emissions. And some of the frustrations that we've had in Alberta has been a recognition that Canada alone cannot solve global emissions. We just can't. We're a tiny portion of what is contributing to climate change. Doesn't mean we don't do our part, but there's been an increasing frustration that we're being asked our Paris Agreement commitments compared to what so many other countries have done, including the big emitters who don't actually they're not even part of Paris. A very significant frustration that we're hearing, for example, from people in Quebec, we're just anti-fossil fuel. Right, and that a pipeline represents fossil fuel, we don't want that because of climate change. That's different than environmental spill, degradation from spills, etc. So I think if there were an opportunity to have more conversation between Quebec and Alberta to talk about what are the real concerns about pipelines, are the concerns about climate only, and if climate is really the issue, then having a pipeline or not across Quebec is not going to make any difference globally in terms of emissions. And so I think what you've just done, I'll take that as an opening of a door to have some of those conversations with not just you, but people in Quebec.
Yeah, so what it is I'm here to open doors for conversation. I'm here also to tell you things as they are. A government of the Parti Québécois will follow its people will and perspective on that topic, in which you have global climate changes, you have risk of spills, you have classic economic evaluation of what's in it for Quebec. You have all this. But a government of the Parti Québécois will follow its people. But at least there would be, on several topics, not just this one, information flowing directly, but I want to be transparent on the fact that as of today, I don't see social acceptability for it. Mm-hmm. If you tell me that it's because maybe some arguments, I mean, I'll leave it to my people, but the Parti Québécois has been very democratic throughout its history. Referendum is one of the tools we have, but we're loyal to the will of our people, and we will remain as such. As of today, I don't see such a project or social acceptability, but I'd rather have the conversations we need to have directly from Alberta's standpoint, because on several occasions I hear Alberta speaking and I'm just, okay, I actually think the same about how the federal is either screwing up or abusing its powers in that specific file. So I'd rather hear it in bilateral direct relationships rather than through the federal government.
So we just met in person this morning. You don't strike me as much of a follower. You strike me as very much a leader. And I do think there's an open door there because I appreciate we want to follow the views of Quebecers, but I also think political leaders have not only an opportunity but an obligation to lead as well. And if some of those open doors and some of those conversations allow different perspectives on the part of leaders in the two provinces, including you and your team, then there are opportunities to use that and lead.
I'll give you another example. I find that the judiciary power is making more and more creative interpretations of the Charter of Human Rights to a point where democracy is not respected. I have a few very clear-cut examples in Quebec recently. So Quebec wants to change the tuition fees for students from outside Quebec. And then you have a court saying, no, you can't do that because we've interpreted the charter in such a broad way that we've decided in your place. And you have that for family law where they tell us you need to change the civil code. You have that for, of course, the French language and the secularism laws in Quebec that are being challenged. So sometimes I hear things from Alberta and I'm just, okay, well, we should talk because I have on different topics, and it doesn't mean we have the same stance. We don't need the same position on everything, but there's a topic on, as to how we can deal with this intelligently, because we don't want disconnected elites. I mean, one principle about democracy is the further and the less accountable the person is, the more abuse of power you'll get. So if you have a government that is very far in Ottawa and a regime of judges that are all aligned to the Liberal Party of Canada, and they don't have to, they're not accountable to anyone. And I'm not a fan of judges being elected. I'm just saying if the scope of their intervention is never ending in terms of growth, what do we do? I mean, I'd like to have a talk with other provinces that see the same thing. I'd like to have a talk on several other areas where our collaboration and the level of commerce could be optimized. So it's very difficult sometimes to make business within Canada. Might be easier to just go south to the US, in which case I have time to spend on this. My intuition is that our collaboration will always be there. So there'll always be a relationship between Alberta and Quebec, between the provinces. My problem is the framework and the abuses of power that comes from it. So I'm more of a reformist than a revolutionary person. I'm looking for how reforms could actually work, and I don't think the Constitution will be reformed because we've been through that. We've been through Meech, we've been through Charlottetown, we've done all that. So I'm looking for something else. The basis for it, whether it's oil and gas, environment, education, judiciary system, the basis is to have some space of conversation. And my finding when I thought it was interesting to come in Calgary was that arguing on whether Quebec's choice would have been Alberta's choice is really irrelevant. It's two separate parliaments, two separate democracies, and of course they don't make the same choices. That's really irrelevant. So at least we open up some space. I don't know where it could lead, but it would be an improvement.
This comment has nothing to do with a province being separate from the country or separate from each other. But it is true that the countries, the independent countries of the European Union, can trade more easily among themselves than our provinces can, which is a shame.
And they are countries.
And they are countries.
So they decide, they have their own language, culture, they make their own choices, and yet they seem to be more efficient in terms of trading among each other.
So I wouldn't say that we're less efficient because we're not countries. I would just say we're less efficient because we don't talk to each other.
I would disagree on that in the sense that, as I said, the Canadian framework makes it difficult to make those changes. So if we change, we might find another framework that addresses all this, but just talking to each other might not be sufficient if the framework doesn't help. At least we can agree that being countries would not prevent us from anything. We would just talk to each other and say, on what do we need to work? What do we need in place in common? But it would be based on respect of our own democratic free will. And you wouldn't have the abuse of power that started basically with the First World War, because when the federal government started collecting taxes directly, then it became a picnic, like an endless barbecue with just you take all you want, an all-you-can-eat buffet. So if we think of another framework where that could not be possible, we could also deal with parts where it's not optimal.
So, Anthony, we would not be here without Dr. Sayers, who heads our, he said at the beginning, but I think it's worth repeating, he now heads our Canadian governance policy area. That could be an interesting study piece. But I do actually think that one of the, we are actually embarking on some major work on how do we do better as a country. We have regulatory problems, not just in, you know, truck axle measurements requirements, not just in, you know, standards for toilet seat manufacturing, which actually is a thing. We have modular home builders who are doing really interesting work, and particularly now when we have housing challenges, they can't get economies of scale because building codes are different in all the jurisdictions across the country. Farmers have problems with labeling requirements, inspection requirements that are different. What I see is, as a country, we're not doing very well, and part of the problem is that we're not talking to each other. So I actually think, regardless of whether we have independent countries or we're all still provinces, yeah, but we have much more to do in terms of collaborating. And that will happen issues.
Under a PQ government. But I need to go further so that you start thinking about it. I think the independence of Quebec will happen. And when that will happen, we will come back to you saying, what's your take on the situation, and what are your perspective on what could work? Because there'll be so many places where we need to work together, or at least actually where we have an interest in working together. So it goes beyond what's a given for me. Mm-hmm. The given is that we'll talk directly and see what can be done in our mutual interest, respecting each other's parliament. That's some new stuff, and that's good. But with Quebec being independent, or Alberta taking the lead through a referendum, that we don't know what the future will be made of. But my perspective on it is that it would be an opportunity to think of another framework that is respectful. And it's the lack of respect that is the topic this morning, the abuse of power that is consistent throughout that Confederation history. And so there's a lot of space and there's no tension as far as I'm concerned. And it doesn't mean that I agree with all the orientations of Alberta, and I don't believe it should be the discussion. It's a democracy. They're entitled to their own choices, and it's not for me to tell you what to do, and the opposite is also true. Once that is established, many things can happen.
It's interesting, and I do want to move into some Q&A. But when I asked earlier about culture, and you reinforced even in your comments the importance of culture and the desire to maintain and enhance the francophone and not just linguistic but other culture, Québécois culture. But just now you said respect, and I had asked, is there really, is the difference in Quebec, the culture piece is perhaps deeper than what people might think of Alberta. But the respect piece, I think, is absolutely clear. I think there are parts of this country, and I would volunteer as an Albertan, that the last 10 years, we might speak the same language as Ottawa. We might speak, have lots more similar cultures in the sense of not even being based linguistically. But respect and the lack of respect has been a problem. And I think that has been a fundamental part of the frustration that many people are seeing in Alberta.
And my message to you on that is, because we've been through that topic for 50, 60 years in Quebec, spheres of power will always try to gain more power. So you might catch a break if Alberta's government right now says enough is enough and we want this, we want that. You might catch a break if the stability of Canada, the irony with the Parti Québécois, it's really a paradox. It's under the Parti Québécois that we gain things in Ottawa. Because there's a threat, so they're just, okay, I'll leave something on the table for now, and I'll wait for the Liberals to come back in Quebec, and then let's go. So overall, you see the situation in Quebec going in the wrong direction. It's a decline in all spheres. So it is frustrating for everyone to see a government that didn't listen and was in such an ideological drift to come back in power once again. It is a genuine issue. And my point here is, it's not because you'll catch a break for 2-3 years that structurally that regime will stop gaining power over your powers. And governments that are too far, not accountable, will not be good at tailoring public policies for your specific context. It is of a vital importance for Quebecers who want to speak French and have their difference respected, but it's also a vital importance for Alberta's orientations that that are totally not aligned with the Liberal Party of Canada's stance on many subjects. So there's a common point, I think, that must be said. Structurally, over time, it's obvious that that government who didn't raise any tax income now raises almost half the tax incomes. It's structurally obvious that it will always grow its power as much as they can when they have an occasion over the province's power. It's called centralization, and it's a human thing. If you give power to someone, they will try to get as much as power. They'll never leave it on the table. Never.
It'll be very interesting to see you in action if you do indeed become premier.
Exciting is the word.
We'll watch with great interest. We do want to have some opportunity for Q&A, but we really want to reinforce the fact we are at a university, and the real purpose of this is really to enhance debate, to discussion. So we want to restrict the questions. Don't be angry. But we want to restrict the questions to students. So, students in the room, questions? Sure, you put your hand up. Hang on, we'll just get you a mic.
When you were introducing yourself, you talked about how Ottawa, with immigration, has created the systems of ethnic clientelism, and how, as opposed to that, in Quebec, you guys, do a better job of integrating immigrants to be Quebecers. I just want to know, like, policy-wise, what specifically have you guys done to achieve this? What's the difference?
The difference, first of all, is in the planification of how many people. So Quebec has been favorable to immigration in general. And it had a very good system whereby there's an integration through the school and the workplace in the French language to give a chance to that language on the long run. And there's been some thoughts into how you can organize integration, hosting people, so that they identify to Quebec, they participate in Quebec society, and they get opportunities. So it's been a constant field of our immigration ministry is about that. But if Justin Trudeau, and now Mark Carney, because it hasn't changed, they go on saying, you are welcome at Roxham, and then there's no planning. It's just sabotage of a system that worked very well for us. And if you change the criteria at the airports so that you can have more asylum seekers, more hosting, just more and more, it's the lack of planning. You cannot plan anymore. So you cannot plan housing, you cannot plan services, because we have free services. So of course there's an incentive to get those free services for billions of people on earth. And French language, culture, there's just no planning possible, because the federal government unilaterally decide to force an agenda based on the Century Initiative that was decided on Bay Street. By the way, Mark Carney was part of that, and he hired the same people. It's just the same thing. It's undemocratic, and it's pure sabotage of something that worked well for us. We had a system whereby we hosted a fair proportion of people. We had planning of all those aspects to make sure it goes well, and it worked well. And now it doesn't work. It's pure sabotage. And it's not as if they don't understand, they didn't hear. They know, and they do it for ideological or political purposes.
I think there are an awful lot of people who now recognize that the federal government didn't just create problems for Quebec, that the immigration
that's where it's
policies
so interesting to talk about it from different point of views, but still it's the same thing. You have a parliament that is elected, they're clear about their intentions, and then the federal government is just, I don't care. I'll do my thing. So my answer is, who are you? Who are you? Like, what legitimacy do you have to overrun democracy? Who are they? I mean, I don't give them much legitimacy at this point because it's just wrong decision making, and it's really intentional. It's not even a mistake. It is sabotage of an immigration system that worked well, and it's important to understand it's fragile, 2% of Francophones, as you know from other provinces, and we had a good system, and people were very favorable in terms of how it went, and then it all crashed for no reason.
We had a good system across the country for years. We had a good system, and I think many people have recognized that decisions were made that were problematic. We have a couple of academics here at the School of Public Policy, Ron Kneebone and Rob Falconer, who have been doing fabulous work on immigration, but then how it affects homelessness and how municipalities are dealing with homelessness. So really good work. I also will do just a bit of a plug, and here you are formally invited, or your team. We here have embarked on a major productivity initiative, major summit last fall. That transformed into 6 sub-summits on specific areas of productivity challenge. We've had, we did one in Ottawa on tax and competition. We did one in Vancouver on major infrastructure. We did one in Halifax on interprovincial trade. We have one coming up in Montreal, and the focus of that one is, in fact, labor and immigration. And it's being led by Trevor Toome, who's over there, I can see. So we'll make sure that your team knows about the logistics of that session, because this is a really important conversation.
We've written a 100 pages paper on the Century Initiative and immigration in Canada, where we compiled all studies that show that it doesn't help the shortage of labor. It actually makes the shortage of labor more acute. When the housing is not available, when the services are. So we've gathered all the studies, so we'd be glad to participate, because we're a very small group and we need to make that research on our own, and sometimes but we've done some research, so we'd be glad to participate and see what other universities have worked on those issues, and maybe it can lead to a sustainable model, and the conversation is useful for everyone.
Yes, I think that would be great. So, sorry, back to questions. Students in the room.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm wondering if the Parti Québécois has been in consultation with any Indigenous nations about the independence movement in Quebec, and what some of the perspectives have been.
So among the nations that suffered the most from a colonial-based regime, because the Constitution of 1867 is undemocratic, nobody was consulted, and it's an indirect link with the colonial rule. So Francophones have a good argument to say that system didn't work for us. But those nations who have the better, the argument that is the most obvious, are First Nations. And what we have said, and I had meetings 2 weeks ago with leaders, Indigenous leaders, I think the UN framework will help if we achieve change. Because in the current framework, whether it's the Indian Act or the Constitution in itself, I mean, there's a lot of starting events by saying that we recognize something, and there's a lot of Justin Trudeau crying and dressing up and stuff. But if you look from a legal standpoint, not much has changed because the framework, once again, is frozen. So from the independentist, Quebec independentist perspective, if you break the colonial regime, and you say we're open for another system, first thing you'll do is turn around to other nations and say we treat you as equal. So we have two options before us once the independence of Quebec is declared. You can either take the current status under the Canadian regime, who will grant it to you automatically if that's your free will as a nation that wants to self-determinate, or we will negotiate a new deal based on parameters that the UN has started to work on, and based on a few success stories worldwide, we'll try to innovate and find a durable and permanent nation-to-nation system that makes people secure and that makes the whole topic stable, sustainable, durable. So it's an opportunity. It's a very interesting opportunity because change creates change. It creates a space. So, of course, it's very complicated because you have several different nations whose demands are not the same. So you cannot just say, it cannot be a one-size-fits-all. It demands a lot of time, and it demands that it's a reality. But once it's a reality that there's no more Indian Act, and there's no more constitution preventing to just negotiate a new deal, it will take time, but it will be achieved, and it will create, I think, some form of pride, or it will be a success to celebrate if that change create sustainable relationships between nations.
I think another area of opening doors for conversation is in the area of, at the very least, private sector business and Indigenous relationships. There are so many examples after, a long effort of not doing it well, but for the last couple of decades, I will say, and I personally get very frustrated at the rest of Canada, especially central Canada, not being aware of some of the successes that have been achieved here in, going from employment to business creation to now increasing numbers of full equity partnerships between Indigenous nations and the private sector. But it's been the private sector. It's been very much an acknowledgement we need to partner. Yep. It didn't come easily, but I'm often surprised whenever I'm in Ontario or Quebec or elsewhere in the country to hear people talk about Indigenous relations without any concept of some of the hard lessons learned, but some real successes out in this part of the world, but very much based on natural resources, for sure. But anyway, I can go on, and I shouldn't, because really this is for you. Other questions? But yes, I think there's some real opportunity to have conversations about that. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Deborah, and I was encouraged to ask this question just because you said you want to be transparent and direct, so I'm going to do the same. I'm just wondering, in your ideal democracy, what would be, as we recognize Canada has grown to be a very place for diverse cultures, however, we do have those underlying Canadian values and ethics. In your ideal democracy, what are the accommodations for these cultures to exist and not like completely adopt to the Quebecan culture? Because I guess your main point was trying to sustain that Quebecan culture, and there are different cultures in there as of now, I'm sure. So what are your accommodations for that, if there is? And second question is more to home. I'd say, what would you advise students who would like to enter into politics or go through that path and include their voices, basically?
The second question I didn't hear correctly.
What advice would you give to students who would like to enter into politics and include their voices? If
I give you such advice. To the first question. There is a doctrine within the Parti Québécois, it's called cultural convergence. So it's basically to say, there's a really positive input in having different cultural backgrounds. And yet, you have a fragile cultural environment in Quebec that cannot duplicate. Because when you talk about cultures or the multicultural model, it is a culture that exists elsewhere. And so if we cannot sustain the original culture in Quebec through that multicultural model, there's no other duplicate. I mean, so the balance we found is cultural convergence, where we expect, and it's very theoretical, because in concrete what happens with that, I mean, I don't see a direct link with democracy, because democracy is really just about voting and respecting that the result is the result and we need to act accordingly. But from a cultural standpoint, the doctrine of the Parti Québécois is that we expect and we ask, although there are no constraints except for the language used in schools and workplace, we ask to participate and to become fully a Quebecer in a very improbable quest of having that culture survive through times, and yet to keep and to valoriser, to highlight other cultural background that will contribute to that common space of culture. So it's to say it's not just cultures living aside. There's one common culture where we all participate through democracy, but through language and culture and sports. So we feel that we're part of the same society, and yet it is not hindering at all the contribution of many cultures that just join in and contribute. So if you want, you're interested on that, it's called Convergence culturelle, and it's you'll find it in some of our documents.
And for anybody who's interested in getting in politics, we can have that conversation.
Oh yeah, getting on politics. It's, if you're willing to pay a price, it's the most useful and interesting thing you'll ever do. But it's not for free, especially in this context. So it's really a matter of choice. I could have done something interesting in the private sector or as a lawyer. Sometimes I ask myself how I actually got in that situation. But if you feel that you can contribute to certain things that might change in the right direction, you will never regret spending time on it. It's just difficult to sustain. It's like a marathon. Social change, political change never occur overnight. And there's a kind of, you need to be moderate, I think, to achieve the marathon and actually maybe get some change that you can say it was all worth it. So I think I'd rather have, if my advice is, you'd rather be consistent and do something politically and socially all the time than to just throw yourself, give everything, and create a fatigue, and at the end think nothing has changed yet. Because those things are long-term, and those things are not guaranteed. So people told me that I was really inadequate and I had no chance of the Parti Québécois surviving only 4 years ago. So you can't do things for result. It's not a utilitaristic calculation. It's public service in the sense of hoping. It's a lot about hope and giving without calculating what you'll get in return.
I've been around a lot longer than he has, you can tell. And so I was able to do some really cool stuff in the practice of law and some really, really interesting stuff in the private sector and some politics. I think I was one of the ones who kind of threw myself into it and, wasn't maybe as moderate. But I will say I have never met a single person who spent time in politics who regrets it. It can be massively frustrating. It can be costly. It can be tough. But most things we do in life that are worth doing tend to be tough. So
it's really about this. It's really about the notion of sufferance. It's funny, but it's not, because in the current times, people expect that the purpose of life is to be happy right now and to maximize your happiness right now, as if there was no past, no future, no purpose, and then you die. I mean, so making sacrifices are part of building something in your life, no matter in what field. But making sacrifices to a point where it's unsustainable is not helping you neither. So it's striking a balance, but there's a cost to meaningful things. That's for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, merci.
Well, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you very much for your time here today. It's been a great privilege. So I just want to ask, so if the Parti Québécois wins the next election in 2026 and they form government, and then they decide we're going to pose the question to the voters of Quebec about an independence referendum, and then they decide this Canadian framework, as you posed it, doesn't work anymore, and then they decide to move towards a path of separation. Where do you see Quebec sort of, place in, North America going forward if that happens? Say, relations with Canada, maybe relations with the United States. How do you see that playing out if this whole thing plays out as it might?
Well, it's interesting because Alberta, Prince Edward Island, Ontario behave much like countries under the crisis with the tariffs. So the whole argument for Canadian nationalism or identity building was we're stronger together. But that's actually not what happened, actually. In light of what's happening in the United States, it's important to understand that the relationships in terms of political weight will always be an unequal one. At least when Alberta speaks for Alberta, or when Quebec speaks for Quebec in that context, it's your own interest, your own message, your own strategy. Whereas when Canada speaks, you don't know they speak for which interest. It's very blur. I don't think, given the commercial frameworks that are pretty standardized worldwide, I don't think there's much change in one or the other scenario in terms of positioning. I just think that it will still be a delicate negotiation with the US with at least your own strategy. And the relationship with other provinces, it's difficult to say, but it's as if I feel that once independence of Quebec is declared, there'll still be interest, a kind of natural interest in keeping something together. Mm-hmm. But without the abuse of power, without the problems we cannot solve right now. So it will be kind of a tipping point event where things afterwards are being recreated, but I wouldn't be here if I thought that those relationships were not for the long run. I think that's where it's heading. Sometimes it's intuition in politics, but there are many. Take Norway and Sweden. Sweden was really angry at Norway for separating, and in the book of the question of Quebec separatism, you'll find a quick history of that. So Norway was always dissatisfied, trying to get more powers, and Sweden was always saying, "You are annoying. What do you want? We're fed up." At some point, the separation occurred. Sweden at first was a bit angry, but in the long run, if you look at the collaboration between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, it's not the same country, but it has a very high level of collaboration and coherence. Look at Slovakia and Czech Republic. Look at a few examples where those countries are respecting their democracy, but yet have a natural tendency to collaborate on many things. So I think that's where it's heading. I have no guarantee, but I think it's the most useful and probable scenario. Yeah.
I lived in Prague for over a year, and learned an awful lot about what happened in the separation between of Czechoslovakia into Czech and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Fascinating, fascinating. Anyway, yes, go ahead.
Good morning. I had two questions. The first being that during this whole conversation, you have mentioned talking of how the framework currently does not work. My first question to you would be, what is this new framework that you believe will work, or if not, improve our current situation within Canadian politics? And then my second question would be, as a policy student, always when we're introducing new frameworks and new ideas, there are new trade-offs that come with those frameworks. And so my second question would be, do you know what those trade-offs would be, and have you considered how they'll impact both not only Quebec, but should they decide to continue under a Canadian policy, how they'll affect our just Canada as a whole?
It's a very interesting question, because the same question occurs in economics. So you'll have studies in Alberta saying if Alberta was a country, we would be richer because we would stop sending money to Ottawa, we would do things our own, it would be less expensive, and our strategy in the energy sector or other sectors would be different, and we would be richer. People opposing independence will say, well, there are some variables that you mentioned, but you have no guarantee. The thing is, it's always like that. So you need, if you want to see if a reasoning or a project is sound, you need to look at the fundamentals, but you will never control all variables. So from a political standpoint, it's the same principle. My change is independence. It will most likely trigger the independence of the west of Alberta, depending on how you see it. Once those independence are a reality, you will have a natural tendency to get back somewhere discussing what we need to do together. And I don't know if you can call that a constitution or a contract, but it will prevent the abuse of power as I just named, but it will also serve a few things where we're better off working together. And that framework, I don't know the variables. What I'm interested in is the fundamentals. Fundamentals is that it will respect the democratic will of each parliament. And for that, it will be useful because that deal will be responding to genuine needs and consent within those populations, the exact opposite of the current federal regime. Not surprisingly, because it's a colonial regime from the start, it has that mentality. I don't see provinces living aside and not having that framework. I don't see me not being here again working on stuff with Albertans in the scenario of an independent Quebec, because I don't see how it would be in our interest not to do that. But it will be very different, more limited, more specific, better managed, because we will not give an open bar, an open buffet in terms of, from a financial standpoint. It will be a whole different environment. And to me, it doesn't matter if I don't control those variables, because of course it's a negotiation. What's important is whether the fundamentals of that plan are sound, whether it makes sense to have each parliament decide what's good for them and what we need to work together in that new framework. If the answer to that is yes, it's a good idea, it's more logic, the rest will be fine, as I think.
I think we're getting the hook. So if anybody had a question and you didn't get to ask it, I think Monsieur Plamondon is going to be here doing some media work, and so maybe if you're lucky, be able to ask something of him after we're finished. You're here for a little bit to do that. Can you please just join me? This has been, like I said, what better opportunity for a university, and in particular a School of Public Policy, to have you come here, thank you again, engage in the debate, prompt some pretty good questions, and I guarantee prompt some ongoing discussion and debate about much of what you've said here today. And I will reinforce the concept of the opening of the doors. I think that's fantastic.
I'm very glad that happened, and I think there'll be other events like that, most probably. So thank you for attending, and I'll be around after the media.
So
so
please
I'm there.
join me in thanking Monsieur Plamondon.